All right, so this is your grammar lesson for Thursday, April 2nd. Before we get into our grammar lesson, I just want to remind you that for this weekend, you need to continue to read if you haven't finished reading the first part of the Jungle Book. I think it's 1 through 38, pages 1 through 38. You need to answer the first 2 pages in the Jungle Book packet that I gave you. And then you also need to write your research paper over the animal that you chose. And if you watched the first video from the week, what was that, Tuesday the 31st? If you watched that video, the outline of how your paper needs to be written is detailed in that video, okay? All right, so we have been talking this week all about adjectives, and we know that adjectives modify or describe nouns and pronouns. They answer 4 questions. They tell us which, whose, how many, and what kind of, okay? So we already know all of that about adjectives. Then we talked about how adjectives can be used to compare things. And when we are describing one thing, our adjective doesn't change. When we are comparing 2 things, then we add an ER to the end of our adjective. Or if our adjective has more than 2 syllables, a lot of times we will add the word more in front of the adjective. If we are comparing more than 2 things, so like 3, then you are going to add EST to the end of your adjective. And if your adjective has more than 2 syllables, a lot of times you will add the word most. So we looked at, on Tuesday, words like small. So we have small, smaller, smallest, sweet, sweeter, sweetest. And then yesterday, you looked at some adjectives that the spelling changes a little bit, but they still follow that same rule. Happy, happier, happiest. Heavy, heavier, heaviest. Today, we are going to look at irregular adjectives. We've talked about irregular nouns. Today, we're going to look at irregular adjectives. So right now, I am going to be on page 297, and I'm going to go all the way through page 300, okay? But right now, I'm starting on page 297. Okay, let's see. How many of you have ever heard a person who talks like this? I have. Sometimes I might be that person. This cake tastes gooder than that one. The cut on my leg is worser than the cut on my arm. Alice is feeling more better than she did yesterday. Those sentences do not use correct English. Today we are going to look at why. Okay, so some adjectives have irregular forms of comparisons. So we can't follow the add the ER or the EST to the end, or even add the word more or most to the beginning of the word. They just don't follow that. So irregular adjectives, the whole word has to change. And on page 297, they have given you a list of some irregular adjectives. I'm going to hold my board up, and you are going to see the list from page 297, or you can look in your book, okay? All right. So in the first column, so this column over here, we use those adjectives from the first column only when one thing is described. So words like good, bad, little, much, and many. Grandpa is feeling bad today. Just talking about one person, I'm describing him. This recipe calls for only a little milk. Once again, I'm only talking about one thing. We use adjectives from the second column, or the column in the middle, when two things are compared. Better, worse, less, more. He felt better yesterday than he does today. So I'm comparing two things, yesterday and today. This recipe calls for less milk than that one. Comparing recipes, this recipe and that recipe. Finally, we use adjectives from the third column, or the very last one, when more than two things are compared. Best, worst, least, most. He feels best when he can sleep well. Of the four recipes, this one calls for the least milk. So I'm comparing four recipes. We never use the words more or most with irregular adjectives. So we would never say mother's bread tastes more better than mine, or mother's bread tastes better. We would say mother's bread tastes better than mine. Okay, so looking at those adjectives here, we have good, better, best. So the whole word has to change. Bad, worse, worst. Little, less, least. Much, more, most. Many, more, and most. Okay, so much and many have the same adjectives of comparison. All right, so I'm going to put this down. If you have your book in front of you, I'm going to look at oral drill, or the on page 298. So oral drill on page 298. So they've given us some adjectives, and they want us to give the three forms of comparison. These, I'm looking at all of them, are the ones that we just looked at, okay? So the ones that were on page 297, we already know the three forms of comparison. Good, better, best. Little, less, least. Many, more, most. Bad, worse, worst. Much, more, most. Okay? All right. Now on part B, it asks us to give the correct form of each word in parentheses. I'm not going to do all of these, but we're going to look at a few of them. So we're on part B on page 298. So number 1 says Noah lived through the bad flood in history. All right, so we're talking about all of history. What are my forms of comparison for the word bad? Bad, worse, worst. Okay, remember, one, bad, describes one thing. Worse compares two things. Worst compares more than two. And in this sentence, we're talking about all of history. Okay, so more than two. So we're going to use the word worst. Noah lived through the worst flood in history. All right, this loaf looks good than that one. So we're comparing two things. I wouldn't say gooder. So what are the forms of comparison for good? Good, better, best. This loaf looks better than that one because I'm comparing two things, this one and that one. Number 3, her picture is the good one of all. So once again, we've got the word good. I have 3 forms of comparison: good, better, best. And here I'm talking about the best one, I just said it, of all. So I'm comparing more than 2 things, I'm comparing all of them. So I'm going to use the word best. Her picture is the best one of all. Okay. On part C, they have given you some sentences, and they want you to correct the mistakes that are in the sentences. Number 1, part C on page 298. Her report was more better than his. Now remember, we talked about when we have an irregular adjective, we do not use the word more or most. So in the case of number 1, all we're going to do is we are going to drop the word more. Her report was better than his. Okay? This apple tastes gooder than that one. Gooder is not a word as much as some people might want it to be. So the forms of comparison for the word good: good, better, best. This apple tastes better than that one, okay, because I'm comparing two things. All right, so really, this lesson kind of built on the last 2 days. So we've already talked about adjectives. We've already talked about the 3 forms of comparison. All we've added on today is saying that some adjectives, the words have to completely change. And they've really kind of given you the main ones that we're going to talk about. Good, better, best, bad, worse, worst, little, less, least, much, more, most, many, more, most. Okay? So your work for today, you are going to do page 299, written practice A, 1 through 5, B, 1 through 3. Now on these, you are not writing the whole sentence. You are only choosing the correct adjective and writing the adjective down, okay? Then I also would like you to do review and practice B and C, okay? Now, for the review and practice, if your parents are okay with it, then they can go over review and practice with you out loud. So that's not something you have to write down, but I just want to make sure that you're remembering some of the things that we have talked about. Okay, so it's always good to go back and do those review and practices. All right, so today's Thursday. This is our last day for this week, and then we will start again next week. I sure am missing you guys. I hope y'all have had a great week, and I hope you have a great weekend. See y'all later.